By the time the sun came up that Thursday, I had already changed the locks on my own garage, and neither of them knew it yet. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter for this story, but you can call me Wilhelmina, because that's close enough. I'm 66 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I lived a quiet, orderly life in a modest brick house on the edge of a small town in the Blue Ridge foothills. My mornings started the same way for 11 years, a pot of chicory coffee, the porch swing, and the sound of mourning doves in the maple tree. I'd earned that stillness. I'd raised two children mostly alone after my husband passed, and I'd promised myself that once they were grown and gone, my house would finally be mine again. Then on a Tuesday evening, without a single phone call, my daughter Odalis pulled into my driveway in a moving truck twice the size of my carport, her husband Thaddeus trailing behind in a sedan stuffed to the ceiling with duffel bags and a car seat wedged sideways in the back window. I stood on my porch in my robe, coffee going cold in my hand, and watched them unload boxes onto my lawn like they were reclaiming territory that had always been theirs. "Mom, we didn't know where else to go," Odalis said, not quite meeting my eyes. Thaddeus said nothing at all. He just kept carrying boxes past me into my house, like I was a doorframe he needed to get around. I didn't yell. I didn't even ask a single question that night. I just watched. And if there's one thing my late husband taught me, it's that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who ends up holding all the power by morning. They assumed I'd fold. They assumed that because I was a grandmother, because I was retired, because I was just sitting around anyway, that my time, my kitchen, my bank account, and my Saturdays now belonged to them. They had no idea what was coming. Because within 11 days, I would refuse to babysit their children for one single afternoon, and the explosion that followed would reveal exactly who my daughter had married and exactly who my daughter had become. Have you ever had family show up assuming your kindness was a service they were entitled to instead of a gift you chose to give? If that sounds familiar, you already know where this story is going, and trust me, it gets so much messier before it gets better. If you're ready for this journey, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Hit that like button, subscribe to Roman's Revenge Stories if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story, because this channel is about to bring you so many more of these. Now, let's get back to that Tuesday night because things were about to get a lot more complicated. That first night, they slept in what used to be my sewing room. Odalis had converted it in her head before she'd even set foot inside. I heard her on the phone with her sister-in-law saying, "We're staying with my mom for a bit while we get back on our feet," like it was a settled fact, like my consent was a formality that had already been handled somewhere else. I didn't sleep much. I lay in my bed listening to Thaddeus move furniture around in a room that wasn't his, dragging my grandmother's cedar chest across the floor to make space for a portable crib. Not once did either of them knock on my door to ask if that was all right. By morning, I came downstairs to find my kitchen transformed. Baby bottles drying on a towel I didn't recognize, a diaper bag slung over my grandfather clock, and Thaddeus sitting at my table in his undershirt, scrolling his phone like he'd lived there for years. "Morning," he said without looking up. "We're out of coffee filters, by the way." I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and felt something shift in my chest, not quite anger yet, more like a cold, clear recognition. This wasn't a family in crisis asking for help. This was an occupation. I said nothing. I made my coffee in the French press instead, the one they hadn't found yet, and I sat on my porch alone like I did every morning, watching the doves. Odalis found me out there an hour later, my two grandchildren trailing behind her 5-year-old Persimmon and 3-year-old Ozias, both still in pajamas, both clutching half-eaten waffles. "Mom, can you watch them for a bit? Thaddeus has a job interview, and I need to unpack." She didn't ask like a question. She said it like an assignment. I looked at my grandchildren, their little faces smeared with syrup, and my heart softened the way it always does. I love those children fiercely. But I noticed something in that moment that I couldn't unsee. Nobody had asked me how I was doing. Nobody had asked if this arrangement worked for me. Nobody had said thank you. I watched them that morning. Of course I did. But I made a decision on that porch swing that would matter more than anyone realized yet. I decided I would help, but I would not be assumed upon. There's a difference, and it's a difference most people in my position learn far too late, usually after they've already been drained dry. Have you ever noticed how quickly "just for now" turns into "just how things are"? How often does a favor stop being a favor the moment somebody stops saying thank you for it? I want you to sit with that question for a second, because it's about to become the whole center of this story. By that afternoon, Thaddeus had returned from his interview, which, I later learned, he hadn't actually attended. He'd gone to get his truck's oil changed instead, using cash he'd taken from an envelope in my kitchen drawer, the one where I kept money for the church raffle. I didn't confront him yet. I wrote it down instead, in a small notebook I keep for exactly these kinds of things. Dates, amounts, small moments that, alone, mean nothing but stacked together, tell you everything about a person's character. That night, as I lay in bed listening to my grandchildren's small feet running down my hallway, I thought about my own mother and how she used to say that people will treat you exactly as poorly as you allow them to, no more and no less. I didn't know yet just how far Odalis and Thaddeus were willing to go, but I was about to find out, and it would start with one Saturday afternoon, one simple request, and one answer I gave that would blow their entire assumption of me wide open. The Saturday in question started like any other, except for one thing. I had plans of my own for once. My friend Marguerite had invited me to a quilting retreat 2 towns over, something I'd been looking forward to for weeks. It was one single afternoon that belonged entirely to me. I mentioned it at breakfast, casually, the way you'd mention anything in your own home that requires no permission. I'll be heading out around 11 for Marguerite's retreat, back by 6. Odalise looked up from her phone like I'd announced I was moving to another country. Wait, today? I told Thaddeus we'd go look at that rental property today. You said you'd watch the kids. I hadn't said that. I hadn't said anything of the sort. But I've learned that in certain households, an assumption repeated with enough confidence starts to sound like a memory. I didn't agree to that, sweetheart. I have plans today. The air in the kitchen changed instantly. Thaddeus set his coffee mug down harder than necessary. Your plans are a quilting circle. This is us trying to find a place to live. I think your priorities might be a little backwards, Wilhelmina. He'd never called me by my first name before. Not once in 3 years of marriage to my daughter. It landed exactly the way he intended it to. I kept my voice level, the way I always do when someone is trying to provoke me into looking unreasonable. I love watching Persimmon and Ozias. I do it happily, often. But I am not your on-call babysitting service, and I'd appreciate being asked instead of informed. Odalis's face crumpled into something between hurt and fury. So you're choosing quilting over your own grandchildren? Have you ever had someone twist a simple boundary into something that makes you sound like the villain of your own life? That sting where saying no to one afternoon suddenly gets rebranded as abandoning your entire family? I want you to think about a time that happened to you, because I promise you, it's more common than you think, and it's exactly what was happening to me in my own kitchen that morning. I'm not choosing anything over anyone, I said. I'm choosing myself for 4 hours. That's allowed, Odalis, even for grandmothers. Thaddeus scoffed, grabbing his keys off the counter, my counter, like he owned the surface he was standing at. Must be nice. Must be real nice to just do whatever you want while we're drowning. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I answered. You're not drowning, Thaddeus. You're inconvenienced. Those are very different things, and I think somewhere along the way, you've confused the two. I got dressed. I put on the blue cardigan Marguerite always compliments. I picked up my purse, and I walked past both of them toward the door, my heart pounding harder than I let on, because confrontation has never come easily to me, even when I know I'm right. If you leave, Odalise said quietly, her voice trembling with something that sounded almost like a threat, don't expect us to still be here when you get back. I turned around slowly. Odalise, that's not a punishment. That's a plan, and it might honestly be a good one. I walked out to my car, got in, and drove to Marguerite's with my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way. Not from doubt, from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of finally putting myself first in my own home, and the terrifying uncertainty of not knowing what I'd come back to. I had no idea, sitting in that quilting circle 4 hours later, laughing with old friends over lemonade, that my house was about to become the site of the loudest argument it had witnessed in a decade, and that by the time I pulled back into my driveway that evening, everything between me and my daughter would already be different. Before I continue this story, quick one for women over 40. If you've been struggling with stress, poor sleep, headaches, or constant tiredness, please don't ignore it. These can be early signs your body is under pressure, and over time it can affect your heart and blood pressure. That's exactly why I created a simple 21-day reset guide to help you sleep better, reduce stress, and support healthy blood pressure naturally. Check my bio and tap the link now. I won't be leaving it up for long. Now back to the story. I pulled into my driveway just after 6, and the first thing I noticed was that Thaddeus's sedan was gone. My porch light was off, though I'd left it on that morning. The house sat dark and unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your stomach tighten before your mind even understands why. Inside, I found Odalis sitting at my kitchen table in the dark, Persimmon asleep against her shoulder, Ozias curled up on the floor with a blanket that wasn't his. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup smudged in tired streaks down her cheeks. "Where's Thaddeus?" I asked, setting my purse down slowly. "He left," she said flatly. "Said he needed space. Said I was choosing my mother's feelings over our marriage." Her voice cracked on the last word. I sat down across from her, my quilting retreat joy draining out of me, and replaced with something heavier, more familiar, the ancient, exhausting weight of being a mother. "Odalis, what happened after I left?" She told me, piece by piece, and it wasn't hard to fill in the parts she left out. Thaddeus had wanted her to call me at the retreat and demand I come home early. She'd refused, for the first time in longer than I could remember, and it had turned into the ugliest fight of their marriage. He'd said things about me, about her, about what a disappointment it was that she came from a family of selfish women. He'd packed a bag and driven to his brother's place and told her not to bother calling. Have you ever watched someone you love get blamed for a boundary that had absolutely nothing to do with them? Have you ever sat with your own child while she cried over a man who used your simple no as an excuse to reveal exactly who he already was underneath? If you've lived through something like this, I want you to tell me in the comments, because I promise you, this part of the story is about to matter more than you think. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything about Thaddeus at all, not yet. I just reached across the table and held my daughter's hand, the same hand I used to hold crossing parking lots when she was small. "You didn't cause this," I said quietly. "A man who explodes because his wife's mother wanted one afternoon to herself was never going to hold up under real pressure. This isn't about quilting, Odalis. This was already cracked long before today." She cried harder at that, not because it was cruel, but because some part of her already knew it was true. That night, after I'd carried both children up to bed myself, I sat alone on my porch swing in the dark, the mourning doves silent for once. And I thought about how strange it is that the truest test of a person's character isn't how they behave when things are easy. It's how they behave the one time you say no. I didn't know it yet, but Thaddeus's disappearing act wasn't the end of the chaos in my house. It was only the beginning of the real war, one that would arrive at my doorstep 3 days later, angrier, louder, and far more determined to make me pay for the one afternoon I dared to take for myself. 3 days passed in an uneasy stillness. Odalis moved through my house like a ghost of herself, tending to Persimmon and Ozias with a kind of hollow efficiency, barely eating, barely speaking. I didn't push her. Grief, even the quiet kind that comes from a marriage cracking rather than ending, needs room to breathe before it can be examined. Thaddeus called twice a day, according to Odalis, though she rarely picked up. When she did, I heard her side of it from the next room, clipped, defensive, exhausted. He wasn't calling to apologize. He was calling to relitigate, to remind her, again and again, that none of this would have happened if her mother hadn't been so selfish. On the third evening, he showed up at my door without calling first. The same way he'd shown up 3 weeks earlier, no warning, no consideration, just an assumption that my door would open because it always had. I answered it myself, before Odalis could. "I'm here for my wife and kids," he said, not quite looking at me, the way he never quite looked at me. "This has gone on long enough." "They're welcome to leave with you," I said calmly, "if that's what Odalis wants. That's her decision, not mine." "This is your fault," he said, his voice rising. One hand braced against my doorframe like he intended to push past me. "You couldn't just watch your grandkids for one afternoon. You had to make it about you. Have you ever had someone stand in front of you and rewrite the entire story, casting your one small boundary as the villain of their downfall? Have you ever wondered how a person can look you dead in the eye and blame you for consequences that were entirely their own making? I want you to really sit with that question, because what happened next taught me more about this man's character than 3 years of Thanksgiving dinners ever had. "Thaddeus," I said, keeping my voice level even as my pulse hammered in my ears, "I watched your children more times in 3 weeks than you watched them in 3 years. By your own wife's account. One afternoon was not the thing that broke your marriage. You were already broken. You just needed someone to blame for it. His jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought he might actually raise his voice loud enough to wake the children upstairs, and some old protective instinct in me straightened my spine, readied myself for whatever came next. Instead, Odalis appeared behind me in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes red but steady in a way I hadn't seen in days. "Thaddeus, go home," she said. "I need time. I'm not ready to talk about any of this yet, and showing up yelling at my mother on her own porch isn't going to change that." He looked at her like she'd slapped him. "So that's it? You're choosing her?" "I'm choosing myself," Odalis said, and I felt something in my chest crack open with pride I didn't know I was still capable of feeling. Something Mom apparently taught me how to do, 3 weeks too late, but better late than never. He stood on the porch a moment longer, searching her face for the version of his wife who would always cave first. He didn't find her. He turned, got in his car, and drove off into the dark without another word. I closed the door slowly and turned to my daughter, who was crying again, but differently this time, not defeated tears, but the kind that come when something inside you finally, painfully, starts to heal. I had no idea that night that the real turning point of this entire story was still ahead of us, because 2 days later, Thaddeus would return one final time, and what he brought with him would force Odalis to make the one decision she'd been avoiding for years. 2 days later, I woke to the sound of a car door slamming hard enough to rattle my bedroom window. I looked outside to see Thaddeus striding across my lawn with a manila folder tucked under his arm, his jaw set in the particular way of a man who believes he's about to win something. I met him on the porch before he could knock, Odalis close behind me, still in her robe, her eyes wary. "I talked to a lawyer," he said, holding out the folder like it was a weapon. "You can't just let her live here indefinitely and keep me from my kids. I'm filing for custody arrangements. Temporary, for now, until she comes to her senses." The folder sat between us, unopened, heavy with a threat neither of us had asked for. Have you ever watched someone escalate a private family disagreement into a legal battle simply because they couldn't stand to lose control of the narrative? Have you ever felt that specific chill when someone you once trusted stops trying to reconcile and starts trying to win? I want you to think about that feeling, because it's exactly what settled over my porch that morning, cold and unmistakable. Odalis's hands were shaking, but her voice wasn't. "You haven't asked to see them once, Thaddeus. Not a single phone call to the kids in 5 days, and now you're threatening custody because I won't apologize for staying at my mother's house?" "I'm protecting my rights," he said stiffly. "You're protecting your pride," I said quietly. And for the first time, he turned and actually looked at me. "Nobody asked you," he snapped. "No," I agreed. "But this is my porch, and you brought this conversation to it, so you'll hear me anyway. You didn't lose your family because Odalis stayed here 3 weeks. You're losing your family because the first time things got inconvenient, you disappeared, and then you came back not with an apology, but with a lawyer's letterhead. That tells her, and frankly, it tells me everything she needs to know about what the next 30 years with you would look like." His face reddened, the folder crumpling slightly in his grip. "This isn't your business. My daughter and my grandchildren sleeping under my roof is entirely my business," I said, my voice steady now, steadier than I expected. "And you standing on my property threatening legal action instead of asking your wife how she's doing that tells me you already know you're losing and you're trying to win through fear instead." Odalis stepped forward then, closer to me than to him, and I felt the shift in the air between the three of us, subtle but seismic. "Take the folder home, Thaddeus," she said. "If you want to talk about the kids, you call me and we talk like adults. Not with paperwork, not with threats. Not with my mother standing in the middle of something you created." He stood there a long moment, and I watched something flicker across his face, not remorse exactly, but the dawning, uncomfortable realization that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the version of Odalis who would beg him to stay. He left without another word, the folder still tucked under his arm, his tires kicking up gravel as he pulled away too fast down my quiet street. Odalis exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for 3 weeks straight. "I think I need to see a lawyer of my own," she said softly. I put my arm around her shoulders, feeling the tension finally start to loosen in both of us. "Then we'll find you a good one. But first, come inside. Let's get the children up, and let's have a real breakfast, the three of us, like we should have been having all along." I had no idea, standing on that porch, that the folder Thaddeus carried away that morning would come back into our lives one final time, except the next time, it would be Odalis holding the paperwork and it would be Thaddeus standing on the outside of a door he no longer had any right to walk through. The weeks that followed settled into something I hadn't expected, a new rhythm, imperfect but honest. O'Dallas found a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Fairlith, who specialized in family cases just like this one. Within days, papers were filed, not for custody battles or dramatic ultimatums, but simply for a clear, documented separation, temporary support, and a parenting schedule that didn't depend on anyone's mood swings. Thaddeus fought it, at first, the way men like him always do, with phone calls that veered between wounded and furious, with messages sent late at night that O'Dallas learned to screenshot and forward straight to Fairlith without responding. He tried guilt. He tried nostalgia, sending old photos of their wedding day with captions like, "Remember when we were happy?" He tried, once, showing up unannounced again, only to find that I'd had a small sign made for my porch railing that simply read, "Please call ahead," and beneath it my house numbers, visible and impossible to misunderstand. He didn't come back after that. Have you ever watched someone slowly realize that the tactics that used to work on you simply don't land anymore? That the guilt trips, the sudden charm, the wounded phone calls, all of it just bounces off because you've finally built something inside yourself that wasn't there before. If you've ever felt that shift in your own life, I want you to tell me about it in the comments, because that shift is exactly what I watched happen in my daughter over those 6 weeks. O'Dallas started sleeping again. She started laughing at the dinner table, quietly at first, then more freely, teaching Persimmon how to braid her own hair, while Ozias narrated an entire imaginary battle between his toy dinosaurs on the kitchen floor. My house, which had felt invaded just weeks earlier, slowly transformed into something else entirely. Not an occupation, but a shelter. There's a difference, and I finally understood it in my bones. I want to be honest with you about something, though, because this story isn't only about Thaddeus. It's about me, too, and the quiet lesson I had to relearn at 66 years old. There were nights, in the middle of all this, where I doubted myself, where I wondered if I'd been too harsh that Saturday morning, walking out the door for a few hours of quilting while my daughter's marriage was unraveling behind me. Guilt is patient. It waits for your quietest, most exhausted moments to whisper that maybe, if you'd just given a little more, sacrificed a little more, none of this would have happened. But then I'd remember Thaddeus's face when he called me by my first name for the first time, like a weapon. I'd remember the folder crumpling in his grip on my porch. I'd remember that a man who explodes at one boundary was never solid ground to begin with, and that my daughter deserved to find that out at 29, not at 59, after decades of shrinking herself smaller and smaller to keep a fragile peace. Have you ever had to remind yourself, in your own quiet moments of doubt, that setting a boundary wasn't the thing that broke something, it simply revealed what was already broken underneath? I think that's one of the hardest truths any of us ever have to sit with, and I think so many of you watching this right now already know exactly what I mean. By the 7th week, the custody and support arrangements were finalized, simple and fair, drawn up by Fairlith with none of the theatrics Thaddeus had originally threatened. He would see the children every other weekend, at a neutral location, no more unannounced visits, no more midnight phone calls laced with blame. O'Dallas signed the papers at my kitchen table, the same table where Thaddeus had once demanded coffee filters like he owned the room. When she set the pen down, she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. Not relief exactly, but something steadier. Something that looked, for the first time, like the beginning of her own quiet resolve. I had no idea that night that the true final confrontation of this story wasn't going to come from Thaddeus at all. It was going to come from O'Dallas herself, in a conversation with me that would change the way I understood the entire 3 weeks that had led us here. It happened on a quiet Sunday evening, the kind where the light turns amber early, and the whole house smells like the roast I'd put in the oven that morning. Persimmon and Ozias were asleep, worn out from an afternoon of chasing fireflies in the backyard, and O'Dallas and I sat together on the porch swing, the same one I'd been sitting on the morning she and Thaddeus first pulled into my driveway uninvited. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke. "I need to tell you something, Mom, and I need you to just let me say it without saying anything back right away." I nodded, folding my hands in my lap. "That Saturday when you left for the quilting retreat," she said slowly, "I was furious with you. Not because I actually needed you to watch the kids. Thaddeus's mother lives 20 minutes away, and she would have come in a heartbeat if I'd asked. I didn't ask her. I used you leaving as an excuse to start a fight I'd been too scared to start on my own. I sat very still, letting her continue. I think some part of me knew the marriage was already over, months before we ever showed up on your porch, she said, her voice thickening. But it felt easier to blame it on you being selfish than to admit that I'd married someone who disappeared the second things got hard. It felt easier to be angry at you than to be honest with myself. Have you ever done that in your own life? Taken the fear you had about a much bigger truth and aimed it at the safest, most stable person in your life instead? Have you ever hurt someone you loved simply because they were the only one steady enough to survive the blow? I want you to think about that honestly, because what O'Dallas said to me that evening is something I think so many of us have done to someone at some point without ever fully realizing it. I'm not angry with you for that, I told her gently once she'd finished. I understand it more than you know. I did the same thing to my own mother once, a long time ago, over something far smaller than a marriage. We aim our fear at whoever feels safe enough to survive it. That's not an excuse, but it is human. She leaned her head on my shoulder then, the way she used to when she was small, and we sat together in silence as the fireflies started blinking to life across the yard. Thank you, she said finally, for not folding. If you'd caved that Saturday, if you'd canceled your plans and rushed home and pretended everything was fine, I don't think I would have ever found the nerve to look at my marriage honestly. You leaving that day didn't break anything, Mom. It just stopped me from being able to keep pretending. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for weeks, maybe longer. Because that's the part of this story I want you to sit with. More than anything else, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love isn't rescuing them from every hard moment. Sometimes it's simply refusing to disappear yourself, so that when they're finally ready to face the truth, there's still someone steady standing there to catch them. We didn't solve everything that evening. There were still hard months ahead: custody logistics, the slow work of Odalys rebuilding a sense of herself outside of a marriage that had quietly diminished her for years, the delicate process of explaining to two small children why their parents wouldn't be living in the same house anymore. But something had shifted permanently in that conversation on the porch swing, something neither Thaddeus, nor time, nor distance could undo. I had no idea that Sunday evening, that 6 months later, I would be standing in my own backyard again, but this time for something worth celebrating, and it would show me exactly how far my daughter had come since the day she first pulled uninvited into my driveway. 6 months passed the way real healing usually does, not in one dramatic sweep, but in small, unglamorous increments. O'Dally's found a little house 2 streets over, close enough that Persimmon and Ozias could still run through my backyard chasing fireflies whenever they wanted, but far enough that it was unmistakably hers. She got a job at the local library, something she'd wanted to do since college but had quietly given up on somewhere along the way. She started sleeping through the night. She started, slowly, sounding like herself again. Thaddeus kept his scheduled weekends mostly. He was never quite warm with me, and I never expected him to be. But he stopped showing up unannounced, stopped calling me by my first name like a threat, stopped mistaking my daughter's kindness for weakness. Sometimes the best outcome isn't reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply two people finally understanding where the boundary lines are and staying on their own side of them. That backyard gathering I mentioned came in early autumn, Persimmon's 6th birthday. Streamers strung between the maple trees, the smell of cider and roasted chestnuts drifting across the lawn. Odalys stood near the picnic table, laughing at something her new coworker had said, looking lighter than I'd seen her look in years. Ozias ran past me in a dinosaur costume, shrieking with joy. And for a moment I just stood there and watched my family, smaller in some ways now, but so much steadier than it had been the day that moving truck first pulled into my driveway. I think about that Saturday often, the quilting retreat that started everything. I think about how easy it would have been to cancel my plans, to swallow my own needs the way I had for so many decades, to keep the peace at the cost of my own dignity. I think about how that one small refusal one afternoon, 4 hours, nothing extraordinary, became the crack that let the truth finally show itself. Here's what I've come to understand. Sitting on that same porch swing most evenings now, coffee in hand, doves calling from the maple tree exactly like they used to before any of this began. The people who truly love you will never resent you for having boundaries. They might be startled by them at first, especially if they've never seen you enforce one before. But startled is not the same as broken. Only the people who were relying on your boundarylessness to survive will ever call your boundaries selfish. If somebody in your life reacts to your first no with rage instead of reflection, I want you to remember this story because that rage is telling you something true about them, and it has nothing to do with the smallness of what you asked for. Odalis is doing well now. Persimmon and Osius are thriving. And I finally have my quiet Tuesday mornings back, my chicory coffee, my porch swing, my stillness. I didn't get it by being cruel to my daughter. I got it by refusing to disappear from my own life, even when it would have been easier in the short term to just give in. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you of your own mother, your own daughter, your own quiet Saturday that changed everything, I want you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in my position. Hit that like button if you believe boundaries and love can exist in the same house. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, someone who's been mistaking their exhaustion for love for far too long, share this video with them. Subscribe to Roman's Revenge Stories. Turn on notifications because there are so many more stories like this one still to come, and trust me, some of them go even further than this. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next one.